In this tutorial, we'll be learning how to create this satisfying rainbow color sorting marble contraption in Blender that even includes physics-based rotating pegs. So, let's get started. Alright, so opening up Blender 4.5, I'm gonna delete the camera and the light, and we're gonna start right off with the default cube. Here in dimensions, I'm going to set the real world height, width and length of the box. Hit Ctrl A and apply the scale. Now I'm gonna make the box hollow by removing the top face and applying a solidify modifier to give the walls some thickness. Click on even thickness and then let's set it to like 4 millimeters. And so now we have a hollow box, but the problem with this is that if I am now gonna try and like add in all the contraptions inside of the box, so let's say we add in a little sphere right here, then it's gonna be really difficult to work on this without like having to constantly reach in. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna click on this button right here, Object Properties, and then under Viewport Display, we're gonna set this to Wire. And this will allow us to essentially reach into the box itself, and it'll still give us a little contour so we know we're not messing up anything. So here inside of this box, I want there to be a platform right here where the marbles are going to rest for a bit. Then there's going to be a slab right here which then gets removed, and then the marbles are going to tumble their way down a little corridor of cylinders, and then all the way at the bottom there's going to be these little holes where they will all fall in. So let's start from the bottom. Let's do those inner walls first. For this, I'm going to select a cube and I'm just going to scale that all the way in. And then I need to make sure that the edges of this remain within the wall, essentially. Once again, hit Ctrl A to apply the scale. Make sure you get 111 here. And now I'm gonna move this one around while holding down Ctrl so that it stays within increments. Now, I had set the entire width of this box to be 28 centimeters. So if I just do 4 centimeters every single like gap, then I'll have 7 slots for colors. And so what you've probably been taught to do in this scenario would be to go, okay, move it across, then Shift D, move it, Shift D, move it. And now, although Shift D isn't necessarily a problem, especially in a case like this where we're only going to have 6 of these slabs, I want you to know that if you're going to be copy and pasting something around that is going to remain the exact same, like for example these walls, none of these walls are going to be any different from one another, right? So instead of then using Shift D, you should press Alt D. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a bunch of copies, but they will still keep the same object data. So let me show you exactly what that means. If I move this over 4 centimeters and then I press Shift R to repeat that action, underneath object data properties right here, I don't know why the text is jumping across like that. All these little walls share the object data called cube.001. Normally, if we use Shift D, Blender would first have to load in this wall, and then this wall, and then this wall, and then this wall. But with Alt D, it just has to load in this one wall, and then all the other walls will follow instantly. Which, again, it's not gonna matter super much with like just 6 walls, but when we're gonna load in like 1,000 marbles, then it is going to significantly reduce render time. And another upside to this is that if we just edit one of the walls, like take this wall for example, all the other walls will automatically follow suit. And so we can go over here and add in a little bevel. Press Ctrl B and then use the scroll wheel to add in some more edges. Alright. That looks pretty good. And then before we go any further, I'm just gonna select all these walls right here. Hit M to create a new collection. And I'm just gonna call this inner box. So this collection is gonna contain all the things that are gonna be inside of the box. Now let's add in a cylinder. Scale it to be within the walls like that. And then Shift Y so that it doesn't scale along the Y axis. Ctrl A to apply scale. And now I'm just going to create some copies of these cylinders that are going to function as pegs essentially for the marbles to tumble within. Again, I'm only using Alt D to copy. And then I'm going to copy all these up and then Shift R to repeat. And then once again, press M to move them in that collection we made. I am once again going to take a cube, scale it within the walls. Let's apply the scale. And I'm just gonna take this face right here and then scale it down. I should probably scale this down as well. In fact, maybe I can like push this edge up a little bit. Maybe it's not as important for this edge to be as sloped as the other one. Add a little bevel to this as well. And then let's apply a mirror modifier. Use the box as the mirror object, and then it will mirror it to the other side. And then lastly, I'm just gonna take a cube, and then we will scale this to be the slab in the middle. And then since this is supposed to be a more practical object, this one's not going to be intersecting the wall. However, I am going to make it poke through right here on the other side, so that, like, for example, if there was someone standing right here, then they could actually like grab the slab and then slide it out. But for now, I'm just going to take a little edge loop right here and then select along the edge. You can do an edge select in edit mode by holding down Alt, which is pretty handy. And then with extrude along normals right here, I'm just gonna... Oh, and here is why we should always remember to apply scale, because now it should be completely even. There we go. And then I'm also going to apply a little bevel modifier to this just to keep the edges from being completely sharp. Now, a slab puncturing a wall is obviously not possible. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the box, go back into edit mode, press Ctrl R to create a loop cut. And I'm just going to slide it up towards this box right here. And then we'll create two on either side. And then I'll have one going straight through the middle as well. Only this time I'm gonna scroll up to create two edge loops. And then I'm just gonna scale these inwards so that they go just along the slab. And now I can go into edit mode, select this face and just delete it. And then before I forget, I need to make sure to put this in the collection. And then while we're at it, let's also give the slab its own name. Same with the cube. And so what we have right now is an enclosure with all these objects in the middle. But I want them all to be part of their own object, basically. I'm gonna apply a Boolean modifier to the outer walls. And I'm gonna set this to union, operand type collection. And then we set it to that collection, which we created earlier, which contains all of the inner workings of the box. And so now we can simply go ahead and uncheck our inner box collection. And now we have one object containing everything that we need for the simulation. Alright, so the physics simulation that we're gonna be using in order to visualize a bunch of marbles stumbling down this contraption is called a rigid body simulation. And there are two types of rigid bodies in Blender during the simulation. The first one is a passive rigid body, and the second one is an active rigid body. A passive rigid body will not be affected by physics during the simulation, but it can still be moved around with animation. And an active rigid body, on the other hand, will be affected by physics, and it can also interact with other rigid bodies. So in our simulation right here, let's hide this slab for the time being with H and then add in an icosphere with subdivisions of 4. I want this marble right here to be an object affected by gravity and have it be tumbling around through this contraption right here. So my marble will be an active rigid body and the walls and the pegs will be a passive rigid body. So if we go to physics properties right here, all we need to do is click on a rigid body and it will automatically apply a rigid body simulation to this object. By default it's set to active, so now I just need to apply it to my outer walls as well. Only this time I'm gonna set it to passive. And now to start the simulation, all we need to do is press space and... ejection! Alright, so what's happening here? Well, the reason that the ball is getting launched up is because by default, Blender wants to keep its rigid body simulations as optimized as possible. The shape of the actual object is not the same as the object that Blender is using in order to calculate the rigid body. Right now, it's just using a box for the physics simulation. It's not actually computing anything that's happening within. And that's going to become apparent when we look back at the physics properties right here. and see right here that it's using a convex hull for the shape. And so what a convex hull is you can imagine it like wrapping the object very firmly in stiff plastic, right? And so like it's completely ignoring this opening right here, and it's just brushing over the entire face like this. That's not snapping. So instead of convex hull, we are going to use mesh. And for source, we are going to use final. And that is going to make sure that Blender processes the object exactly for what it is. But before you go applying mesh to literally every single one of your objects, thinking that that's more ideal and more accurate, remember that this is also a lot more difficult for Blender to process. So if you go back to shape right here, the top 4, which are called primitive shapes, these are easiest for Blender to process, and then followed by convex hull, and then followed by mesh. Mesh is the least preferable choice, so only use it when you have to. And there's also compound parent, which is basically like if you're using an object that has children, but we're not using any of those, so you can ignore that one. And so in the case of a marble, which object do we use? A sphere. And now if we press play, we get a tumbling marble. But before we go copy pasting 1,000 marbles, we should probably optimize these settings a little bit. The first setting we might want to change is mass. Now, mass is not super important for rigid bodies. You can easily get away with incorrect masses and you probably won't even notice in the end, but like, there's also no reason not to set it to something that is at least a little bit more accurate. More importantly, however, we have friction and bounciness. When an object interacts with another object, that object will also have a certain value for friction and bounciness, and then those two values will multiply with each other in order to give a certain friction or bounciness. So for example, right now this marble has a bounciness of 0, and the, the cascade has a bounciness of 0. Multiplied together, there's not going to be any bounce. Even if I set this to 1, there's still not going to be any bounce because 1 times 0 is still 0. No bounce. If I were to set the bounciness of this marble right here to 1, then it's gonna be a perfect deflection of velocity, and it's gonna be like an impossible bouncy ball that's happening right here. So I would say, because like both a marble and this enclosure right here are made out of glass, we can expect both of their bounciness values to be somewhat around the same level. But if we, for example, had like, I don't know, maybe this was a cloth right here, then we would set the bounciness of this material to be low and the bounciness of the glass material to be a bit higher. Because like also the marbles are going to be interacting with each other, right? Maybe have both of them be 1.5. Yeah, that looks pretty good, I guess. And friction, I don't think friction is as important, but I would assume glass doesn't have a lot of friction, so I'm just gonna leave that to be a little bit low. And so right now we have a pretty realistic marble tumbling down. However, there are a couple things you should change first. First of all, very important, the frame rate. Make sure you set the frame rate right now because it'll be very difficult to change it once we have the animation baked. Right now the marble is tumbling down really quickly. And now, it feels quick, is what I'm trying to say. So perhaps you want to slow down the process of the marbles falling. Should you be allowed to change gravity? And in my opinion, I say yes. You absolutely should be allowed to change gravity. It's not like anybody is gonna go in there with a measuring stick and like calculate exactly like, is this gravity accurate or not? No. If you think that it looks better with lower gravity, well maybe 4 is a little bit too much, but like if I set it to 6 or something, like if you think that looks better, by all means, go for it. It's not a VFX shot, it's not necessarily supposed to be realistic, we're just trying to create something that looks satisfying. So I do definitely advise you to try and experiment with the gravity a little bit, but who knows? Maybe you like the way it is, maybe you don't want to change it, maybe you do want to keep it realistic, and that's totally fine. But I'm just saying, in case you want to change the gravity, you can do that right here. Alright, with all the boring settings and technicalities out of the way, now it's time to actually get to the fun part. So first, we need to take this slab and turn it into a passive rigid body, so that the marble doesn't go through it. Then let's set that to mesh. Although this time I'm not going to set the source to final, because if I were to set it to final, then that basically means that these little bevels on the edges right here from the bevel modifier would also be taken into account for, but that's completely unnecessary. They're not going to do anything. It's just going to increase processing time. So leave that as the form. And now firstly, you'll want to give your marbles a little bit of time to rest, you know, come to a stop, before we then take out the slab. Click on K in order to open keyframes, and then the first keyframe will be for location. Then let's go 1 second further into the timeline, move it like so, press K again. This time I'll create a keyframe for location and rotation, and then I'll have to increase the timeline a little bit, but then go another second or so forward, and then move it all the way up like this, and then location and rotation, and then it will do something like that. You know, you can go into the graph editor if you want, and then maybe take down the easing of this a little bit, make it look kind of nice, but yeah, overall, I think this is probably about good enough. You'll notice the slab is being removed, but the marble is staying perfectly in place. And the reason it's doing that is because by default, Blender doesn't care about animation on passive objects, because we need to check this box right here. Animated, and now if we restart the animation, we should see the marble tumbling down. And oh, it's getting stuck right here. The reason it's getting stuck right here is actually because of another setting that we forgot to change. Right here in scene properties, there is a cache right here. I'm just gonna set this to like a bunch of millions, and yeah, now the animation will be guaranteed to last forever. I really like the idea of also adding in some rotating pegs to the simulation. So let's take our marble right here and put it over here. Now I'm gonna go and recheck our inner box collection, and let's just remove this cylinder right here to make room for a rotating peg. Actually, before you remove it, put the 3D cursor there, then remove it. And now I think for our first rotating peg, I want there to be a little star shape right here. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a circle. I'm gonna set it to 10 vertices. Let's rotate that like so, then scale that way down, and then let's make it about this big. And in order to turn it into a star, we can select all the uneven vertices and just move that into, I don't know, do you want a bulgy star or a really sharp star? I'm thinking something kind of in the middle. And then let's fill that up. First, apply the scale, then add in a solidify modifier. And then instead of solidifying it in either direction, if you set the offset to 0, then it will go perfectly along either side. Now this time I don't actually want it clipping into the walls, just barely along the edge of it. And so now we can give this object a rigid body property. Now we want this object to be treated with the solidify modifier applied to it. So we need to make sure we set the source to final. But what about active or passive? Well, we want this object to interact with the marble and the marble to interact with it. So it does need to be an active object, but the problem with it being an active object is obviously if I now press play, we get what you were probably expecting to happen, is it just kind of goes through the pegs and it doesn't remain where it's supposed to stay, right? And here is where we'll need to call out rigid body constraints. Rigid body constraints can be a little bit confusing, especially when you don't know what you're doing, but I'm gonna try to give you some examples and you'll understand what they mean. A rigid body constraint basically takes two rigid body objects and it connects them with some sort of property. But the confusing thing about rigid body constraints is the fact that most of the time, you're not going to be using either two of these objects in order to apply the rigid body constraint to. In fact, most of the time, you'll be using an, why can't I find it, empty. And so right here I have an empty and I'm going to apply a rigid body constraint to it. And then for objects, first and second, I want to connect this cube with this cube. Right now the type is set to fixed, which essentially means that the objects are going to interact with each other as if they were glued together by some magical force. except there is still air between them. But there are all sorts of rigid body constraints. Now, the further down you go, the more confusing it gets. But in this case, I'm gonna be showcasing you what point and hinge do as well. To show this more clearly, I'm gonna change this cube to be a passive rigid body so that it remains in the air. And just a heads up, this cube right here is what I labeled here as first. So a point constraint basically means that the distance between this cube and this empty right here are gonna remain the exact same. If I set this to animate, it'll just be kinda hanging right there. And so right now the cube is able to dangle and go in any direction that it wants. However, there is another rigid body constraint type called hinge, which basically makes it so that the cube will only be able to rotate along the z-axis of the empty. So if I just rotate the empty like this, whoa, that's not what I wanted, like this, now it will basically rotate only like that. And this is exactly what we want. We will need a passive rigid body in order to act as the hinge of the star. So let's go ahead and put the 3D cursor onto the star and add in a cylinder, rotate it, then scale that all the way down until it looks about right. And now we can just extend this, go ahead and apply the scale, and now we give it a rigid body constraint passive. Since this rigid body already has a pivot point exactly in the middle of the star, we actually don't even need to add in an empty. We can just apply the rigid body constraint to this cylinder right here, make first itself, and then make second the star, set it to hinge. First though, go to object properties, make sure that the z-axis is going in the direction which we want it to rotate along. That's perfect. And now if we press play, we see that the marble is interacting with it. Whoa. Can I put it? There we go. So it's lightly rotating. We can make it a bit more lightweight if we want it to be more sensitive. And now it is so sensitive that it's gonna basically rotate until it doesn't stop. So we will also need to increase the damping of the rotation. So let's see that in test. It rotates for a bit, slows down, and eventually comes to a full stop. And now very simply, I'm just gonna take away a few more spaces and add some more hinges right there. You can simply just copy it with Shift D, and you don't need to worry about reapplying the constraints. It'll simply be done for you. However, I am gonna give these some different shapes because why not? So I'm gonna set this one to be a square, and because of the solidify modifier, it'll already have the same shape. And then this one, I'm gonna make a triangle. Very simple, just add in a circle with only 3 vertices. And then that's a triangle. You can also give them like a bit of a varied rotation right from the start, just to keep everything from being too perfect. We can give it a little bit of a test. Marble stays there. It falls down. And it interacts with the hinges and drops into a hole. And now time for the fun part, or not so fun part for your computer. We're gonna duplicate this marble into oblivion until we have a couple thousand of them. First though, let's give it a new collection, marbles. And so now when I copy them with Alt D, remember, they won't be going everywhere in the outliner. They'll just remain in this little collection right here. So duplicate them, Shift R to repeat. So this is 1,500 marbles right now. Oh boy, my computer. Currently it's processing at about half a frame per second, which actually isn't too bad. I had a feeling it would be worse. And as the timeline is going along, it is leaving behind this little orange trail right here. And that orange trail is the cache. Blender is locally storing the animation data. And if we were to pause right now, then we could actually go back into the timeline, and because it's already processed all of this, it'll be able to just shoot by that really quickly until it reaches the end and it slows down again. So while you wait, get yourself a drink, turn on some music. We're just gonna let this play out until eventually all the marbles are comfortably laying at the bottom. And I will see you guys in a couple minutes. Alright, we are back. So in total that was about 550 frames before all the marbles descended. One thing we need to be very careful with right now is that at the moment the animation is in a very delicate state. If we were to make literally any change to this viewport right now, all this would be deleted. So follow along with me here, because we are going to save this animation. Right here under cache, where we had set it to a couple million if you remember, currently 538 frames are in memory, and it stops just before all the marbles have reached the bottom. Yeah, I want to extend this just a little bit, so I'm gonna make it end at about frame... let's go with frame 600. So once we've set the endpoint, all we have to do is click on bake, and it'll shoot past the orange line really fast before once again it slows down at the end. And now it just has to catch up to this little bit right here, which shouldn't take too long. And so now we have 600 frames in cache, which have an animation stored that looks like this. But the big problem with the animation right now is, for one, it starts off like this, right? With all the marbles in the air. And once they reach the end, they're just kind of wiggling a little bit, which doesn't feel natural at all. So how are we gonna get rid of this? Well, currently we cannot change anything about the bake in the state that it is right now. So what we're gonna have to do is we're gonna have to take all these marbles and turn them into keyframes. So select all the marbles, then go into Object, Animation, Bake Action. First of all, make sure that the start and end frame are correct, but then make sure to enable visual keying. And then also for channels, we don't need to do anything with the scale, so we can disable that. In fact, clicking on it actually enables it. So we want to keep location, keep rotation enabled, and now click on OK. And you'll want to do the same for the rotating pegs as well. So go ahead and select those, Object, Animation, Bake Action, Visual Keying enabled. This time we do not need to have location enabled, so go ahead and disable that, and then click on OK. There we go. We have a bunch of keyframes which control how these pegs are actually being rotated. Now we can go back to our marbles, and let's see, when does this slab actually start moving? Right here. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna select every single keyframe before 150, and we can just go ahead and delete those. And now if we go back into the time frame, nothing's actually changed. And the reason that nothing is actually changed is because these objects all still have their rigid bodies applied to them, and that cache is overriding the animation data. No problem though, we can just go ahead and remove it by going to Object, Rigid Body, and then clicking on Remove. And now, everything before 150, or well, I should say, the marbles before frame 150 are all perfectly in their sockets, and only once the animation starts, they actually start tumbling down. The pegs are doing some of this for some reason, but it's not a blunder. We just need to go into the pegs and also remove their rigid body properties as well. Now everything is behaving just as we want it to, only now it is being controlled by keyframes instead of a bake. And we can use these keyframes in order to clean up the ending right here. So once again, go ahead and select all of the marbles. And then about when the first few marbles start landing, we're gonna select all these keyframes, hit X, and then click on Clean Channels. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna remove any keyframes which only move the marbles just a tiny little bit, but they don't actually contribute to something significant. And this is going to get rid of most of the wiggling. And now I'm just gonna extend the animation, and with my star right here, this channel right here is the one which controls the rotation of the star. And so if you had to imagine how it would move, it moves right around here, and then I would say it comes to a stop about right here. I can simply go ahead and insert a keyframe right here, move it up to where I feel like it would about make sense, select these two handles right here, and then give it a Bezier curve, and now it will come to a gradual stop just like so. And then we do the same for these two. And that is pretty much all of the animation done. Now it's just a matter of applying the materials to the marbles themselves so that they are all rainbow colored. So let's just go ahead and add in a new material. I'm gonna call this one red marbles. And then once I give it that red color, you'll notice that strangely, all the other marbles will immediately have the red marbles material applied to them as well. And that is because they all share that same object data, as we discussed previously. However, in this case, we actually want these marbles to have their own group of object data, and then this group as well, this group as well, this group as well, this group as well. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna call this object data right here the red, and then right here, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna, for the moment being, go back into X-ray mode. Click right here in order to give it a unique object data. We'll call this one orange. That's not how you spell orange. Wow, I am bad. Select all the other marbles, then hit Ctrl L and link object data. And now all the marbles in this collection will also have that orange object data enabled. And then we can just go ahead and do the same for all of the other groups, just like so. Now all of these will still have the red marble material enabled, but the good news now is that I can just go into one of these groups, give it a new material. This one will be for the yellow marbles, and once I change that color, all the other marbles in that group will follow suit. And that was basically all the hard stuff done. We now have a beautiful animation where all of these seemingly arbitrary colored marbles fall into corresponding pockets. Really cool, really satisfying. I guess the only thing you have to do now is just give some glass materials to these things, and maybe give some matte black material to these and the slab right here. Give it an HDRI, and then once you put it all together, you should end up with a scene that looks a little something like this. So without further ado, here is the final animation of the Rainbow Marble Run contraption. So there you go guys, that is the final render. I hope you all had fun with creating this little animation, and I hope you all learned something new about Blender, be it the rigid body stuff or just the creating process in general. And remember, it is 2 vertices and 1 vertex.